Hi, I'm Brett from papercartridges.com, and today I'm going to cover a topic I've wanted to do for a very long time, and that's the influence or the lack thereof of the rifle musket or rifled infantry weapons in the American Civil War. This is a great opportunity, and I'm excited to be part of the History Matters collaboration with a number of great historically themed YouTube channels. And in this collaboration project, we're specifically looking at many of the myths and misconceptions in history and why it's important to challenge these misconceptions and hopefully gain a clearer picture of what actually happened. If you're new here to this channel, welcome. My name is Brett Gibbons. You can check out a lot of other videos where I'm shooting a lot of these vintage Civil War era firearms. But today I'm in the shop here in downtown Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I'm a United States Army logistics officer, and I'm also really interested in the paradigm shifts, the so called paradigm shifts in history, especially in the mid 19th century, where change, technological and tactical change, happened so fast. I've spent the last 15 years or so researching this period, 1845 to about 1870, where we see Western militaries take the leap from the muzzle-loading smoothbore musket to what we could call the modern rifle. And right smack dab in the middle of this period is the American Civil War. Now, the American Civil War was the first war where we see both sides, at least by the midpoint of the war, where the infantry are armed completely with rifles. And the war was supremely destructive. The American Civil War remains to this day the most bloodiest and destructive conflict ever to happen in the Western Hemisphere. Even though in Europe the Napoleonic Wars eclipse it many times over in terms of casualties and overall devastation. But because the Civil War was so destructive, without any other significant conflict to compare it to here in North America, a powerful misconception has emerged that credits the rifle musket, along with antiquated European linear tactics, for the massive scale of the carnage in the American Civil War. This has been repeated everywhere, and if you went to school here in the States, you were probably taught this at some point. And here's one particularly painful version of this misconception, which you might have seen on the History Channel, that summarizes this myth better than I could by describing it.
Grooves on the inside of the barrel, rifling, spin the ball toward its target. The improved accuracy and range are a deadly combination. But for all the mini-ball's technological edge, the Army still uses traditional military tactics.
What made it particularly tragic was modern technology meeting much more ancient tactics. So the death rates were truly appalling.
The troops still face one another openly in lines across the battlefield. But the mini-ball is accurate over a range of 600 yards, easily spanning this distance. And it can be reloaded 8 times faster than a traditional weapon. The effects are catastrophic. The kill rate increases dramatically compared to previous wars. Across the battlefield, the results are carnage, blood and death on a previously unseen scale. By the time of the North's final victory, over 600,000 men on both sides are dead, some 2% of the entire U.S. population.
It gets more painful the more times I watch that. But almost none of that is actually true or relevant in the context of the American Civil War. But what you saw in that History Channel clip has become essentially our enduring national myth that this new rifle musket was a game changer, and the accurate long-range Meunier ball could devastate infantry formations out to 600 600 yards, and that American soldiers, especially Confederate soldiers with civilian firearms experience, they picked up these, they knew how to use them, they took them to the battlefield, and the result was unprecedented battlefield carnage. That is the misconception. Let's go back to April 1865. So Robert E. Lee has just surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox, and the Civil War has finally ended. Now, that same month, April of 1865, the chief of staff of the Prussian army, Helmut von Malka, the elder, publishes a new report on the impact of rifled weapons on battlefield tactics. The Prussians had sent observers to the Civil War, and they were very interested in these new developments in tactics and weapons. And Moltke has received their official reports by April of 1865. But in Moltke's paper, he does not make a single passing mention of the influence of small arms in the American Civil War. Now, the American Civil War was by far the largest war of this era. Both sides were mostly armed with the new rifle musket, at least by halfway through the war. So why was Moltke so uninterested in the use of rifles during these 4 years of intense combat in North America? Now, before you dismiss Moltke as an old-fashioned, spit-and-polish, stuffy European general who was too ignorant, maybe, to learn from the lessons of the American Civil War, consider that the U.S. Army, to this day, right now in 2023, still uses his doctrine of mission command. And in fact, he's quoted all over Army doctrine, which guides Army leaders in the decision-making process. And Moltke was, in reality, he was very, very interested in what was going on in the American Civil War. He very closely followed the campaigns, and even before the war had ended, he had instructed Prussian cadets to study the use of railroads, telegraphs, sea power. He was very interested in these things. And a few years after the war, in fact, General Sherman did a tour of Europe, and he met Moltke, and he was surprised to find that Moltke knew intimately the movements and details of all of his campaigns. Sherman said that Moltke was completely conversant in the strategic situations and movements. So he's not an ignorant old stuffy European general, but Moltke and the Prussians, they just were not impressed with the tactical performance of the infantry in the American Civil War, even though the infantry were armed with the new rifle musket. Now, Prussia actually gives us kind of a good neutral observation ground for the American Civil War. The United States had very good relations with Prussia, going back to Baron von Steuben in the Revolutionary War. And Prussia, only a few years prior in the 1850s, had hosted an American military visit, which included a young Captain George McClellan, who would soon to command the Army of the Potomac in just a few short years. And the Prussians, for our purposes, they were very interested in seeing what the effect of rifled weapons is going to be on the new battlefield. They themselves had recently adopted the breech-loading Dreise needle rifle. So when Moltke and the Prussians, when they look at the American Civil War and they decide that there's really not much to study here in terms of the infantry combat side of it, we really need to sit back and say, why? Now, at least here in the United States, our popular history, like that awful History Channel clip from earlier, has kind of taught us that the Civil War was utterly devastating because the armies were using outdated Napoleonic tactics, but with modern new weapons like the rifle musket. And some historians have recently said that the rifle musket won the war for the North because the Confederates conveniently kept charging over open ground. So we've kind of convinced ourselves that Civil War soldiers, they were issued a rifle, which presumably they knew how to use, and they marched into battle, and they were able to inflict unimaginable slaughter on each other at ranges up to and beyond 600 yards. And now it is certainly true that they did march out and inflict unimaginable slaughter on each other. But the devastating infantry versus infantry combat was not at 600 yards. In fact, it wasn't even at 300 yards or at 200 yards. The average distance of the Civil War infantry firefight was a little under 100 yards. Now, 100 yards is well within the range of the older weapon that the rifle-musket had supposedly replaced, which, of course, was the smoothbore musket. And at the time of the Civil War, the United States Ordnance Department exclusively provided ammunition for smoothbore muskets that was called buck and ball. So this ammunition has one musket ball and three or more pieces of buckshot. And it was extraordinarily effective at these short ranges. So one volley from a regiment, say a 500-man regiment, one volley is throwing 2,000 individual projectiles towards the enemy. So at 100 yards, it was just horrifically effective. Several of the most combat-hardened veteran regiments tried to refuse giving up their smoothbore muskets when they were supposed to get issued the rifle musket, because the smoothbores were just so devastating at short range. 2 days after the Battle of Antietam, a Union general wrote that it is now thought that the musket with buck and ball is, after all, the best arm in the service. If there was anywhere that Civil War soldiers armed with the new rifle weapons could have demonstrated how effective they were out to long range, out to 600 yards and beyond, would have been right here. So I'm standing at the site of the most famous charge of the American Civil War. On July 3rd, 1863, Picketts Charge crossed these fields and they attacked the Union center right where I am standing here at the angle. And these battlefields have been beautifully preserved, especially Gettysburg. So we know where everyone was. We know the positions of both sides. We have the reports of the officers that were there. We also know where the casualties were found. So we can reconstruct what happened here with a fair degree of accuracy and without relying on secondary sources or modern speculation. And we know that except for a few unusual circumstances, Civil War infantry firefights happened between a range of 90 to 140 yards. The Confederate forces, they advanced across these fields. They were taking heavy fire from Federal artillery. But the Union infantry here, armed predominantly with the modern new rifle, did not open fire until the Confederates reached the Emmitsburg Road. So if the Federal infantry here were armed with the modern weapon, the Rifle-Musket, theoretically accurate out to 600 yards, why did they wait while the Confederate infantry, beautiful targets, closed rank battalions, crossed all of those fields and got to the Emmitsburg Road 140 yards approximately away before they finally opened fire? Now, 140 yards is within the effective range of the smoothbore musket. And it's no coincidence that I am here at the monument of the 12th New Jersey, which famously still has buck and ball on top of their monument, commemorating the 69 caliber smoothbore weapons that they were armed with. And they checked this side of Picketts Charge with blasts of buck and ball from short range. But the rest of the Federal infantry, armed predominantly with rifles, held their fire until the Confederates were within smoothbore musket range. And we have to ask, why? Why did they wait until the Confederates were almost on top of them and hold their fire until the Confederates were within the range of the older, more obsolete smoothbore musket? And the answer is that the Federal infantry here, through no fault of their own and their leaders, had simply not been trained on how to use their weapons out to long distance. It takes a lot of skill and practice, and especially training, to use a rifle musket at distances beyond 200 yards. So, to help explain why Civil War soldiers were unable to use their weapons effectively at ranges beyond 200 yards, I want to tell you a quick story, hopefully quick, about Private Gibbons, who enlisted in the U.S. Army. And I went into the Army already really familiar with firearms. I shot a lot as a civilian. And I thought I knew how to shoot. I thought I'm going to be really good at the shooting part of being in the Army. And I was absolutely wrong. The undisciplined plinking that I would go do at home, it did not translate into those essential skills that are needed for successful military marksmanship. So about 5 minutes into that first block of instruction, basic rifle marksmanship one, on PowerPoint, I enlisted in 2010. Like 5 minutes in, I realized I'm way in over my head. I don't know anything that they're talking about. They're talking about trajectory and line of sight, line of bore, bullet drop, all of these things were just totally foreign to me. I never thought about any of this before in my life. And when we actually started shooting a few more weeks into basic training, the drill sergeants are screaming at me because I had so many bad habits from my civilian shooting, and they had to break me of those bad habits. I get out to the range, and there's targets at 250 and 300 meters away. They were so far away, you could barely see them behind that front sight post of the ancient M16A4s that we had. And before the Army, I don't think I ever shot at anything over 150 yards. And when I did, I almost certainly would have missed. So it took weeks of training in the classroom and on the range. And I shot hundreds and hundreds of rounds. But over time, I got better. And I eventually qualified. I qualified as a marksman, which is the lowest you can qualify at, which is pretty embarrassing because I thought I knew how to shoot. But if I struggled that much to shoot the M16A4 as a new soldier, who did have plenty of civilian firearms experience before I joined the Army, Civil War soldiers never had a chance with the rifle-musket, which requires considerably more training and skill to be able to hit a man-sized target at 200 yards and beyond. And this is the reason why the rifle did not influence the American Civil War. With very few and very rare exceptions, Civil War soldiers were never trained on how to use the rifles that they were issued. It's really even worse than that. They were hardly given any opportunity for target practice, and in many documented cases, Civil War soldiers never even got to shoot their rifles before they went into battle with them. So this lack of training and practice, which is combined with a weapon that is challenging to use, meant that the theoretical long-range capabilities of the rifle-musket were never unlocked and achieved on a large scale by soldiers in the American Civil War. Now this is the model 1861 Springfield. This was the most numerous weapon model of the war. Over 1 million of these would be made. And it has, like almost all rifle muskets, has adjustable sights that the soldier can move for shooting at targets that are at various distances. So the closest here, I'll come in, maybe you can see it a little better. Closest is at 100 yards. And these leaves flip up for different ranges on up to 500 yards. So odds are, if you enlisted in the Union Army during the Civil War, you would have been given one of these. And as long as you knew how to aim and fire, maybe from civilian experience, you would know how to look down the sights and aim at your target and probably hit your target, as long as you knew how far away your target actually was so that you could set your sights to the proper distance. So now we do need to get a little technical, and it all has to do with the trajectory of the ponderously slow-moving bullet that was fired by the rifle musket. Modern rifles shoot bullets in excess of 3,000 feet per second. But the Model 1861 Springfield bullet, this moves at about 950 feet per second, which is only slightly faster than the speed of a commercial passenger jet. And it fires a piece of lead that's 10 times heavier than the bullet from a modern rifle. Let's say the M16 rifle bullet. And this thing has a heck of a lot more drag. So that's slowing it down even more quickly than a modern, more aerodynamic Spitzer-shaped bullet. And because this bullet is moving so slow, gravity pulls it down to Earth before it can cover a very long distance, which means if you want to hit a target out at a longer distance, you have to elevate the barrel of the rifle so that the bullet can get launched upwards, cover more distance before it gets pulled back to the ground. Now, to illustrate this, if you took an M16 rifle and you held the barrel perfectly horizontal and fired it, the resistance of the air and gravity would pull the bullet down about 24 inches in 300 yards. So do the same thing with 1861 Springfield, and the bullet will drop 17 feet before it reaches 300 yards. So to hit something at 300 yards with this rifle musket, you have to set the sights, which will elevate the barrel enough to launch the bullet, kind of like a basketball almost, high enough so that it can stay in the air long enough to cover the distance before it is pulled back down to Earth. So here's the trajectories of the M16 rifle and the 1861 Springfield. So you can compare them with the sights of each set to 300 yards. Now, if your enemy is standing out at 300 yards and you don't adjust the sights of the rifle musket, you leave them set to 100 yards and you fire at them, the bullet's not even going to get out to 300 yards. In fact, it won't even get to 200 yards. It's going to hit the ground somewhere between 160 and 180 yards. Even if you set your sights up to 200, the bullet still won't make it to 300 yards. It's going to hit the ground about 30 yards in front of the enemy. But if you did set your sights on the rifle musket to 300 yards and your enemy is standing out there at 300 yards, then the trajectory will line up to the sights. And as long as your aim is good, you will hit that enemy soldier. If you set your sights for 400 yards, though, the bullet's going to fly right over his head. So the takeaway here is to hit an enemy soldier at 300 yards, you must set your sights on the rifle musket to 300 yards. If you go up or down, you're going to miss every single time. And this nerdy trajectory stuff does matter because even the best natural shot is going to be unable to hit his target at 300 yards unless that soldier knows he has to put his sights to 300 yards. The rifle musket is physically incapable of hitting that 300-yard target unless the sights are set exactly to 300 yards. This is just the pure physics of the bullet's trajectory. I'm sure a lot of you watching this probably do a lot of shooting yourself, but ask yourself, can you step outside right now and identify an object that's 300 yards away and get it right? Could you accurately estimate that distance right now without any training? And if the answer is no, well, you're in exactly the same boat as the vast majority of Civil War soldiers. And this problem only gets worse the farther out you go. So if the enemy is standing motionless at 600 yards, just standing there, and you set your sights to 500 yards on your rifle and you fire, your bullet's going to fall 250 feet in front of the enemy. So it's not as though it's going to be a near miss. You're missing by hundreds of feet. It's not going to get the bullet anywhere near your enemy. And that's just with your sight set 100 yards off from where the enemy actually is standing. Back when Private Gibbons was at Fort Benning, I struggled to hit the 250 and 300 meter targets with an M16A4, which is firing a bullet 4 times faster than the rifle musket and has a point blank danger space distance of 375 meters. So without even touching the sights, your target can be 25 meters or 375 meters away, And as long as I aim at M16A4 center mass, I'm going to hit because the trajectory is so flat. And the rifle musket simply couldn't do that, not even close. The soldier had to adjust his sights to match the range of the target whenever the target was more than about 160 yards away, or the soldier's going to miss every single time. The rifle musket's only real advantage over the smoothbore is the capability to hit a target out beyond the range of the old smoothbore. They're both easy to use in smoothbore range. 150 yards. You just point and shoot. With the smoothbore, you don't even need sights. Just point it towards and pull the trigger, and the smoothbore can fire buck and ball. The rifle gives you the theoretical capability, if you know what you're doing, to hit targets beyond the range of the old smoothbore. That was the benefit of having the rifle musket. But if you've got an enemy battalion formed up in line, let's say at 300 or 400 yards, so they're beyond the range of the smoothbores, the whole point of giving a soldier a rifle is to be able to shoot things beyond the range of the old smoothbore. So how does a soldier know how far away the enemy is and what the correct setting is to adjust his sights to hit the enemy? And the answer is simply training and lots of practice. Now, everybody knew this in 1860. There's not a single military, including the United States, assumed that soldiers would be able to pick up a rifle musket for the first time, take it out, and shoot accurately to long range. Everybody knew that soldiers needed training and constant, intense practice, or the advantages of the new rifles are just going to be wasted. Lieutenant Arthur Walker wrote in 1863, so the same year as the Battle of Gettysburg, that without adequate instruction and training in the soldier, the rifle must be as useless as the old discarded smoothbores of our fathers. And he went on to write what is probably my favorite quote that sums up the importance of rifle instruction in the 1860s.
There, separated by a few hundred yards, perhaps less, stands the mark, a massive living target, but unhabituated to a good position, unaccustomed to measure the distance with his eye, and unused to his sight, he cannot hit that target. He throws away high in the air or low on the ground the bullet which should be a messenger of death. Or worse, he stands there like a dummy, to be shot down by the more skilled French chasseur or Prussian Jäger.
In the United States, Lieutenant Cadmus Wilcox, who was shortly to become a Confederate general, he wrote in 1859 that the rifle, whatever may be its range and accuracy, in the hands of a soldier unskilled in its use, loses much of its value, hence the necessity of giving the most detailed and thorough practical instruction. And to provide this instruction, European armies were opening rifle training schools in the 1850s. Officers would be sent to these schools from 2 to 4 months. They would become experts at rifle training, then get sent back to regiments, and they would be in charge of carrying out rigorous training programs for the soldiers assigned to those units. So in the British Army, for instance, soldiers trained year-round in preparation for a 2-week-long annual rifle qualification. And they were tested in estimating distances and in marksmanship capabilities. And in 1859, so 2 years before the Civil War, every single British soldier is firing 90 rounds in an annual rifle qualification. And other countries had similar schools. The French had the quite famous École des Tours at Vincennes. The Prussians, the Spanish, the Danes, the Austrians, Russia, Sweden, they all opened up schools of rifle instruction. Now, in addition to what we would call shooting fundamentals, like sight picture, trigger squeeze, breathing, all that stuff, because the trajectory of the rifle musket is such a parabolic curve, every soldier in these European schools were trained in estimating the distance to their target. And this was really tedious training, but absolutely essential. And over time, with careful guidance by these highly trained instructors, soldiers could develop an almost instinctive ability to determine the distance to the target. And they were frequently tested on how accurately they could estimate the range. In the British Army, in fact, your ability at judging distance actually determined a portion of your pay. You got paid more if you could estimate the distance within a small number of yards, a very close accuracy. And this training was extremely expensive. The schools were expensive, the ammunition for target practice was expensive, and this led to a lot of debate uh, in the 1850s in Europe over whether or not it's really worth it. Is the rifle really that much better than the smoothbore if we need all this extra baggage that comes along with it? But then the British, they fought the Crimean War and then the Indian Rebellion. And in those conflicts, ordinary British line units routinely engaged enemy forces at long range, sometimes 700 or even 800 yards, with highly effective rifle fire. So the ultimate test of battle confirmed that the rifle really does give your army a profound advantage as long as you did all of the hard, expensive, tedious work training up your soldiers on how to use it. So, in other words, you just have to train the modern soldier. That's why soldiers around the world right now are training, because trained soldiers are so much more effective than untrained soldiers. So now it's fair to ask, where was the American school of rifle shooting? And we never had one. Uh, the entire United States Army, keep in mind, before the Civil War, was only 16,000 soldiers. In 1859, an inspector general report to the Army headquarters said target practice for small arms has been almost entirely neglected. Then the war began, and you got hundreds of thousands of enthusiastic volunteers joining the Army, but there's no cadre of trained instructors waiting to receive them. There's no school of musketry for them to go to, and all the weapons and ammunition are urgently needed for the war that is going on right now. And we have to face the truth of that old adage, you fight the war with the army you have and not the army you wish you had. And leadership, both North and South, knew that rifles could and were very effective. They knew how effective the British were in the Crimea and in India, and sometimes commanders took efforts to implement some kind of rifle training. Several Union Army generals, some of the best generals, including Hancock and Phil Kearny, endorsed a simplified rifle training manual in 1862. They said it is much needed, kind of an understatement. Uh, on the Confederate side, General Patrick Cleburne had served in the British Army before the war, so he knew how poorly his troops were using these modern rifles. Uh, he managed to get some rifle instruction implemented in the Army of Tennessee, at least on paper. And the manual that they were using, it covered all the classroom style training and including judging distance. But with surprising honesty, the manual itself confessed that the situation of the armies deployed in the field and the constant shortage of ammunition means that soldiers are unable to actually go out and do target practice. So, by and large, there's a post war US Army report that said little attention, strange to say, was bestowed upon rifle instruction before and during the war. And the old regular Army officers who assumed most of the senior leadership of both armies, they knew what rifles could do, but they were also very comfortable with the old Napoleonic style tactics that were based on the smoothbore musket and bayonet. Even officers like Cadmus Wilcox, who had been an antebellum rifle shooting enthusiast, uh, was forced to accept just the reality of the situation. Our soldiers might be armed with rifle muskets that are theoretically capable of engaging the enemy out to hundreds of yards, but there's no practical way to thoroughly train soldiers or give them much target practice while the war is raging. So Civil War soldiers rarely did any target practice at all. When they did, it was normally just a few shots per soldier at 50 or 100 yards. And when they did shoot, it was regarded as a highly exceptional event, something that they literally wrote home about because it was so unusual. And it seems absurd to us today, but many soldiers fired their rifle muskets for the first time when actually in combat. After the war, the U.S. Army went back and studied the records, and they discovered disturbing facts. And I quote, tens of thousands of men fired in battle their first shots with the Army rifle. Now, hopefully, it should make more sense why the Union troops at Gettysburg on July 3rd did not open fire on the advancing Confederates in Picketts Charge until they began to cross the Emmitsburg Road about 100 to 150 yards away from their positions, because anything beyond 200 yards was considered beyond the effective range of infantry fire, even though most of the Union troops at the angle were armed with modern rifles. And if they had been trained, they would have been able to engage at much longer distances, probably out to 6, 7, 800 yards. But it didn't happen. Well, most Civil War soldiers had little to no training or practice with the rifle musket. Both North and South did raise specialized units of sharpshooters, and these units received some pretty comprehensive training. I would argue that both North and South raised sharpshooter units comparable with European units of this time. They received the same essential style of training, in many cases using the exact same manuals and instruction materials that had been sent over from Europe. And one example, one of the most famous examples, is Major Eugene Blackford's Sharpshooter Battalion out of Rhodes Division, Army of Northern Virginia. And these were hand-picked soldiers, and they were given superior weapons. So they were all given high-quality English-made rifles. And also they fired the English-made ammunition, very, very high quality, purchased at insanely high prices, run through the blockade. And Blackford's riflemen were highly trained. Again, they were using the British and French manuals of instruction. And unlike the rest of the Army, because they're a sharpshooter unit, they were given ammunition to carry out quite a bit of target practice. And they also were given a lot of particular instruction on how to estimate the range. So actually, we're going to do something a little unorthodox because one of the very few places in the American Civil War where both sides did engage in long-range rifle musket fire is about 15 feet away. So bear with me. We are just going to take a little walk outside. Again, this was kind of spur of the moment and unplanned. Hopefully, we don't get mobbed with tourists. So this is Baltimore Street, and you can't really see it down there because of there's the hotel and trees. But in 1863, at this position right here, you had a very clear line of fire from this point all the way down to Cemetery Hill, which is about 400 yards from here. And Major Blackford's sharpshooters occupied positions right on Breckenridge Street. So literally this street right here, they grabbed furniture and carts and they built a barricade across the street at this point. And they kept up through July 2nd and July 3rd, a very brisk fire onto Cemetery Hill. And it got so annoying that on July 3rd, the Federals had to bring in some of Berdan's sharpshooters to respond to Major Blackford's sharpshooter battalion. So on July 3rd, while Picketts Charge is taking place just right down there, you've got Major Blackford and the Berdan sharpshooters shooting back and forth at each other right here at a distance of about 400 or 500 yards. And what they ultimately did was they pinned each other down. So it turned into a tactical stalemate. But it's kind of cool, I think, that right outside of my shop is one of the only documented instances of real long-range rifle fire in the American Civil War. Thanks for putting up with me on this little spur-of-the-moment excursion into downtown Gettysburg. Go back inside where there's no tourists to hurt us. There we go. So the other main focus of this collaboration project is to address how the misconception about Civil War riflemen has meaning in our modern world. Basically, the so what, the why do we care? Why do we care whether or not the rifle-musket had a profound effect on the Civil War or not? And I'd submit to you the reason why we care is that the clip from the History Channel, the very painful clip from earlier, and almost everything in that video was wrong. I don't even know where to begin saying the rifle-musket is 8 times faster to load than traditional weapons, or that 600,000 men on both sides were killed, implying that 2% of the US population was killed by the Minié ball and these long-ranging new rifle weapons. But unfortunately, the History Channel and popular books by popular authors, even school textbooks, so many of them teach that the Civil War was so deadly because of these rifles and Minié bullets. And this has created and sustained an exaggerated impact of the Civil War rifle being so much more effective than anything before it. And even more unfortunately, it's created the impression that once Civil War soldiers get handed the rifle-musket, the battlefield carnage became many times worse, with accurate fire out to 600 yards, many times beyond the distance of the traditional weapons. It's a very simple narrative, and it's found easy acceptance and assimilation with our unique American gun culture, and probably a touch of American exceptionalism as well. But we shouldn't believe anything simply because we would really like it to be true. We don't need to blindly insist that Civil War soldiers were superhuman skilled marksmen and rifle experts in order to honor and remember what they did, or to try to explain away the casualties of the war, which were not that much different from the casualties of the Napoleonic era. In fact, we actually dishonor Civil War soldiers when we turn them into anachronistic caricatures rather than treating them for what they were in the time that they lived in. Except for a really small number of guys who got conscripted, the Civil War soldiers volunteered, and many of them served through years of very hard, grueling campaigns. That's why 160 years later, there's still tourists walking up and down the street of Gettysburg, because we're astonished by the courage and bravery and tenacity of these soldiers. But they fought the war in the time and context in which they lived. And it happened to be at a time when modern weapons were being introduced. But these soldiers served in enormous volunteer armies that did not have the time, the resources, the establishments, or the instructors, or the ammunition to train them all up to the level that their weapons that they were being issued required to be used effectively. So we should honor them for what they did. And at the same time, we should remember that you fight the war with the army that you have and not the army that you wish you had. So if you're interested in this subject and you haven't died of boredom yet, going to make 3 quick recommendations for further reading. One of them is my book, The Destroying Angel, where I ironically argue that the rifle musket was the first modern infantry weapon, even if it was mishandled in the American Civil War. This is on Amazon. Another book that I have some caveats with, but generally does a really good job. The Rifle-Musket in Civil War Combat, Reality and Myth. This is by Dr. Hess, who was formerly a professor here at Gettysburg College. And while I disagree with some of his more broad brush strokes, he says the rifle-musket did not revolutionize warfare, period. If he had just added in the American Civil War at the end of that sentence, I would agree with him. But in terms of the research, I do recommend it, if only to maybe contrast with The Destroying Angel, where my thesis here is a little bit different than what Dr. Hess argues. And if you want to know more about the sharpshooter battalions, particularly the Confederate sharpshooter battalions and Major Blackford, Fred Ray's Shock Troops of the Confederacy is fascinating reading, because it tells one of the very few things about the Civil War that haven't been told, and that is the sharpshooter units. And he focuses particularly, of course, on the Confederates, but it's a great introduction to these sharpshooter units. And kind of what I'm interested in is the realization that we need these tactical units. Like, we are squandering the tactical, what's the word I'm looking for? Capability of the rifle musket. And so the commanders in these armies, like, let's train up some guys to the same standard of the Europeans who actually know how to use these weapons. So I recommend Fred Ray's book. And well, that's it. I'm Brett from papercartridges.com. If you've watched this far along, God bless you. And I hope this has been useful. And if nothing else, you don't have to agree with me by any means, but maybe just get some gears spinning about how you consider the Civil War, and maybe some of those popular History Channel narratives that you might have grown up with. So again, I'm Brett from papercartridges.com. Sure to appreciate a like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.